took first-class tickets there, hired a limousine as well as a Mustang convertible while he was there, and stayed an extra 10 days on his own dime over the Thanksgiving holiday several years ago. And I think that there were some members of Congress who raised some questions about whether that was the right thing to do. Now, I'm sure he would say he was there to check out their telescope facilities.
One of the things that caught a lot of people's attention, I can just remember him talking about it, was the reason given for needing a limousine in San Francisco, was it?
Right.
Had to do with security?
Right, and there was a memo early on in which he spent about $30,000 or more on limousine services. When he was in San Francisco, he had scheduled, or in California, he had scheduled a trip that he said had back-to-back, and he had a couple of reasons that we posted this memo on our site at WashingtonPost.com, and you can go read the memo yourself. It also was written up, I gave it to Al Kamen to write up for his In the Loop column on Monday, and you could see it written up there. One of the reasons he gave was he didn't want to have to carry the cash around that would be responsible for having to pay taxis to go from one appointment to another because the taxis would be so expensive, and he considered that a security risk.
Lincoln, Nebraska on the Republican line for James Grimaldi of the Washington Post. We're talking about the Smithsonian. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, folks. You know, it's amazing, but then again, it really isn't. These kind of things go on within the government. And I was wondering what effect, if any, his actions were on the morale of his employees. And secondly, was there any trickle-down effect? That is, let's say any of his senior staff, would they enjoy the same fruits of their labors, so to speak, in this process?
Those are both very good questions. The second question first is we're looking into that. The first question regarding the morale, I can't tell you how many emails both Jeff and Prescott and myself have received, simply thanking us for the stories that we did, and over the years, how many people I have spoken to many, many times who've provided a lot of information and documentation regarding what was going on. For example, for one of the recent stories, I had someone supply me a memo about how everyone is told to turn off the lights in hallways and only use natural light, and they all felt that to be really in contradiction to his sort of lavish lifestyle. Secondly, I will say that the first act of the Regents after Mr. Small left has at least initially been well received, and that's to appoint as acting secretary of the Smithsonian Christian Samper, who's a 41-year-old biologist who was running the Natural History Museum. And I'm going to read this email, if that's okay, that I received yesterday from Bruce B. Collette, who's a research associate at the Natural History Museum. When acting secretary of the Smithsonian, Christian Samper entered the Baird Auditorium in the National Museum of Natural History this Thursday morning, he was greeted by a simultaneous and sustained standing ovation. This highly unusual action of the staff of the Natural History Museum shows the respect and appreciation we have for our leader for the last 4 years, and our belief that he has the qualities needed to lead the institution in regaining the respect and admiration of all Americans.
Plant City, Florida on the Independent line. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for C-SPAN. I hope you can hear me.
We can.
Yes, okay. I have a few comments and then a question. Pardon me for digressing back to 1960, when the first time I visited the Smithsonian with my parents.
Well, I'm sorry, I wasn't born yet, so...
Well, okay, but I was impressed with the jewel of a museum that my government provided for me. In 1970, with my wife and children, we visited the museum again on the mall. It was delightful. I subscribe currently, right now, to the Smithsonian Magazine. But I get brochures for travel all over the world, which I can't afford, rail trips that are beyond my means. And I'm asking, and now I hear about abuses, I'm asking a simple answer: what has gone wrong with the jewel?
Well, I don't know if I know the answer to that question. I know it's the #1 goal for the Board of Regents for the Smithsonian, and Mr. Lamb just a minute ago put up there the supervisorial board, the Board of Regents. I know that's being looked at very closely, and you need to think about this. This was an institution that was created in the 1860s, a completely different era before there was even ever a federal government, with a donation of about equivalent today of $1 billion. You have the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is on the board as an ex officio member, a chancellor who oversees it. The Vice President of the United States is on this board, and he's recently written a letter saying he has a pretty busy day job. We have 9 members of Congress who are both appropriators and recipients of this money, which you might see as a potential conflict of interest, and then 9 citizen regents. I think there's a very hard look that's being taken at the oversight that's done by this particular board. The second thing I will say, and I could tell you that you hear this from the people like the gentleman who wrote this letter here and others about the makeup. Larry Swall was the first non-scientist, non-scholar to run the institution. He was the first businessman to come and take charge of the institution. And so there is a question about what direction will they take. Will it be someone who has expertise, like this Mr. Samper, who's a biologist? Or will they go with someone like Sheila Burke, who's a former political aide to Senator Bob Dole, a former practicing nurse from some years ago, but essentially not someone who comes from this research field. And I think that's the question that's before the regents today.
You have a photograph that you took of the $13,000 conference table in Mr. Small's office.
Yes, sir.
Was that needed?
The table?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. They needed a table probably to have a meeting. I don't know what table was there prior. I'm not really sure.
Why did the executive director, I think, of the executive committee, or the chairman of the executive committee, Mr. Sant, is that correct?
Roger Sant, yes.
Defend Mr. Small almost all the way to the end?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I will say that at one point Senator Grassley has said maybe you shouldn't have a billionaire overseeing a millionaire in terms of the Smithsonian. That maybe they need some people on that Board of Regents who is closer to your callers, for example.
Let's go next to Silver Spring, Maryland, on the Democratic line. You're on the air.
Thank you very much. Earlier you referred to not being able to receive Freedom of Information Act information. As I remember, in the Government Organization Manual, along with Amtrak and Red Cross, is Smithsonian Institution, quasi-government organizations. I have enough history with Amtrak and a little bit with Smithsonian that suggests there's a confusion as to what they're supposed to do. I look at the members of the boards of regents, and all I can think of is we're in a position of having, as with Amtrak, a great many political people who have an interest that associates with their districts, and that there may be a reason, and the reason is just plain confusion as to what they can and cannot do, or perhaps quite deliberately using that as a cover for not doing what you would want them to do, or we all would.
Well, I think you raise very good points about these quasi-governmental agencies, and I have some experience with this, having investigated the National Zoo. We filed some FOIAs with the National Zoo that the National Zoo did respond to and did provide information. But I'll tell you, I first got into this back in 2003 when I heard that someone in our newsroom had filed a FOIA for animal records regarding animals that had died. We wanted the necropsy. A necropsy is like an autopsy for an animal. And Lucy Spellman sent an email back, a reply saying that she would not give that, respond to that FOIA because it would violate the privacy rights of the deceased animal. Now, I wrote a column about that when I was doing the hearsay column, and that got a lot of reaction worldwide. I think it also ended up putting some impetus on the Lucy Spellman, Dr. Spellman, to release those records, which she eventually did. And we wrote about those animal records. We actually found that some of them had been altered. You know, some of the veterinary records had actually been altered sometime after some inquiries had begun into this. So I will also tell you about the National Zoo, that most zoos in the country are inspected by the USDA, by an agency called APHIS. They go and make sure the animals' welfare are being taken care of. The National Zoo had refused to to allow APHIS and USDA to come in saying, we're a federal agency. You can't investigate us if you read the law. So in some instances, they would say we are a federal agency in terms of, for example, inspections of the zoo. When I filed my FOIAs, they'd say, no, we're a creation of Congress. You can't have those records. In other instances, they would say, well, really, we're a 501c3 nonprofit. There is a little bit of a confusion, and I would suggest that the Smithsonian and its legal counsel have used, as a good lawyer might do, the best defense they could put out there possible whenever someone's asking a question. However, that hasn't been good for transparency for the agency and has not been very productive for me as a reporter who's wanted to try to get information to tell you and the public what's going on at their Smithsonian